In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's the rhyme we all learned in school. But behind those simple words lies a story of conquest, cruelty, and consequence. This is not the tale of a brave explorer who discovered a new world. It is the story of a man whose voyage set in motion centuries of suffering. Let's uncover the truth. Christopher Columbus wasn't a nobleman nor a trained scientist. Born in Genoa, Italy, around 1451, he was the son of a wool weaver, a self-taught sailor with an obsession to reach Asia by sailing west. His early years were filled with hardship and ambition. As a teenager, he worked on merchant ships and survived shipwrecks. He read voraciously about geography, astronomy, and scripture. He wasn't highly educated, but he was determined and persuasive. Columbus believed the world was much smaller than it is. He calculated that Asia could be reached by sailing directly west from Europe. Most scholars of his time disagreed, citing the Earth's true circumference, but Columbus insisted. He spent years pleading for support. Portugal rejected him. So did England and France. Eventually, he found patrons in Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, who had just conquered Granada and ended centuries of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Their support wasn't just scientific curiosity, it was a political and religious investment. The Spanish crown wanted wealth, trade routes, and global Catholic expansion. Columbus promised all three. He was granted titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of New Lands, and the right to govern any territory he discovered. These were not just honors, they were incentives. If he succeeded, he'd be rich and powerful. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Palos with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa. The journey was perilous. Crews feared sea monsters, mutiny brewed, and supplies dwindled. But on October 12th, land was sighted. What he found wasn't Asia, but for Columbus it didn't matter. He had reached new land, and that was enough to claim glory. October 12, 1492. The world would never be the same. At dawn, the crew of the Pinta spotted land, an island in the Bahamas, inhabited by the people peaceful, generous, and unaware of the storm about to change their world. Columbus and his men rowed ashore. They were greeted not with fear, but with kindness. They offered gifts, cotton food. They had no weapons, no fortifications, no understanding of conquest. In his log, Columbus described them as very gentle, and noted they should make good servants. They are quick to learn and very intelligent. He claimed the land for Spain, planting a cross and a banner. He took some natives captive not out of malice, he would later claim, but to educate them, convert them, bring them to civilization. But behind the religious justification lay a more sinister motive: power. Columbus quickly began surveying the islands, searching for gold. When he found signs of its small ornaments worn by, his ambition grew. If these people had gold, he reasoned, then Spain must have it all. The meanwhile were confused. They saw strange men with metal, animals they'd never seen before, horses and dogs, and new diseases. They tried to adapt, but their worldview was collapsing. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493 with stories of wealth and opportunity. He brought with him gold trinkets, exotic birds, a few captives, and the promise of an untouched paradise awaiting Christian conquest. He was hailed as a hero, streets filled with cheering crowds. The Spanish crown granted him a second voyage, at this time not as a humble explorer, but as a colonial administrator. But what awaited the islands next would be anything but paradise. Columbus's second voyage was not one of curiosity, but conquest. In September 1493, he set sail again, this time with a fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. This was not an expedition, it was an invasion. Among the passengers were priests, soldiers, settlers, craftsmen, and bureaucrats. They carried seeds, livestock, weapons, and iron chains. Their mission: to build a permanent colony in the so-called New World. When they returned to Hispaniola, they found the fort Columbus had left La Navidad. The men he left behind had abused the local population. In retaliation, they had killed them. This enraged Columbus. His response was swift and brutal. Villages were burned. Hundreds were captured and paraded as prisoners. Dozens were shipped back to Spain as slaves. Many died en route. The island was divided into districts. Each was governed by a Spaniard and supplied with enslaved natives. A tribute system was introduced. Every over 14 had to deliver a set amount of gold every 3 months. Those who failed had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death. This was the beginning of the encomienda sistema model of colonial exploitation that would spread across Latin America. Meanwhile, Columbus established the first Spanish settlement, Isabela, but it quickly fell into chaos. Food was scarce, disease spread, morale collapsed. The settlers began turning on Columbus, accusing him of mismanagement and cruelty. He responded by imposing martial law, using brutal punishments to enforce order. Whippings, hangings, public amputations. Even fellow Spaniards began to question his methods. Reports of his brutality reached the Spanish crown. A royal commissioner was sent to investigate. Columbus was arrested in 1500, chained, and sent back to Spain. He was eventually pardoned, but his authority was never fully restored. Yet the system he created, the ideology he established, endured. The islands were now colonies, the people now subjects or slaves, and Columbus, despite disgrace, had set in motion an irreversible transformation of the Americas. The age of exploration soon became the age of exploitation. What began with Columbus quickly evolved into a complex machinery of domination, profit, and control. After Columbus's brutal campaigns in the Caribbean, the Spanish crown saw the New World not just as a land of wonder, but as a source of endless wealth. And to extract that wealth, they needed a system, a method to convert lands into mines, people into labor, and culture into obedience. Enter the encomienda system. In theory, it was a noble idea. Spanish encomendaros, land grantees, would protect, educate, and Christianize the native populations under their care. In practice, it was slavery under a different name. Indigenous people were forced to labor in mines, gather gold, build roads, harvest sugar. In regions with little gold, they were tasked with farming food for the settlers. Days stretched from sunrise to sunset. Many were beaten, many more simply collapsed from exhaustion. Disease ran rampant. The Europeans brought with them smallpox, influenza, and measles, illnesses to which native populations had no immunity. Families were decimated. Children died alongside their parents. In some villages, entire generations vanished in the span of a few years. The church's role. The Catholic Church arrived hand in hand with colonization. Monasteries were built atop sacred temples. Priests preached salvation, but too often remained silent in the face of abuse. To be baptized was to be bound, not just to Christ, but to the crown. There were voices of dissent. The most notable was de las Casas, a Dominican friar who initially owned an encomienda himself. Horrified by what he witnessed, he renounced his holdings and became one of the first major advocates for indigenous rights in the Americas. He wrote, "What we committed in the Indies stands out among the most unpardonable offenses ever committed against God and mankind." But de los Casas's voice was drowned in a sea of profit. By 1510, the indigenous population of Hispaniola had collapsed. From an estimated 1 million, barely 10,000 remained. The Spanish solution: look elsewhere. They turned to Africa. Thus began the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of African men, women, and children torn from their homes, shackled, and shipped across the sea to replace those the Spanish had destroyed. What Columbus had started had become a blueprint. Conquer, convert, extract, replace. The New World was no longer new. It was a factory. Gold and sugar flowed to Europe. Ships returned, loaded with guns, armor, and priests. And at the center of it all was a system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The ripples of that system are still felt today. What followed was not just death, it was disappearance, the erasure of people, culture, history. In the wake of Columbus's arrival, entire civilizations began to vanish. The of the Caribbean, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million, were nearly extinct within a generation. Some died by the sword, others from starvation. Most were claimed by disease, but all were victims of a system that valued land over life, gold over humanity. This was not accidental. It was the cost of conquest. We often hear numbers: millions dead, 90% of native populations wiped out in some regions. But these statistics numb the story. Behind every number was a village burned, a mother lost, a child enslaved. Narrator: imagine your world, your gods, your language, your songs disappearing, replaced by a foreign tongue, a cross you didn't ask for, a master you didn't choose. And yet, there was resistance. In Hispaniola, some rebelled. In Cuba, they fled into the mountains. In the Andes, Civilizations mounted full-scale wars. The fight for survival was constant, but they were outnumbered, out-harmed, out-resourced. Some turned to diplomacy, others to open revolt. Some adapted, blending their traditions with Spanish customs to preserve fragments of identity. And a few, like Hatui, became legends. Hatui, a chief, escaped from Hispaniola to Cuba and warned his people of the Spaniards' arrival. He organized resistance, but was eventually captured. Before being burned alive, he was offered a chance to convert to Christianity. He asked if Christians all went to heaven. The priest said yes. Hatui replied, "Then I do not wish to go to heaven. I'd rather go to hell, where I won't see any of you." His story, passed through oral tradition, is a symbol of defiance, a memory that would not die. The tragedy is not only in what was lost but in how much of it we still refuse to remember. In textbooks, they are often labeled extinct, but their descendants live on. In Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba, in their blood, in their stories, in their resistance to being forgotten. Colonization tried to erase them, but erasure is never complete. Their silence was never consent, and their survival, that was their rebellion. Today, Christopher Columbus remains one of the most polarizing figures in history. To some, he is a pioneer, the man who brought the old world and new world together, who sailed into the unknown and changed the course of humanity. Cities, streets, even a country, Colombia, named after him. In 1937, the United States declared October 12th as Columbus Day, meant to honor Italian-American heritage and recognize their contribution to American society. But to others, Columbus represents the beginning of genocide, slavery, and cultural destruction. Statues of him have been torn down, school books and each year, more states and cities now observe Indigenous Peoples Day instead. This shift is not about erasing history, it's about correcting it, about telling the full truth. Narrator, history is rarely simple. It doesn't divide cleanly into heroes and villains. It is layered, complicated, and messy, like people themselves. Columbus was brave, yes, but he was also ambitious, ruthless, and, in many ways, blind to the human cost of his goals. He was a man of his time, but that doesn't excuse his actions. He did not discover an empty continent. He encountered civilizations, people, cultures, and he helped bring systems that exploited, enslaved, and erased them. So what do we do with his legacy? We remember it, all of it. We tell the story not just from the perspective of ships and kings, but from the voices that were silenced. We teach our children that courage and cruelty can live in the same person, that progress can come at a cost, and that honoring the past doesn't mean hiding from it. Columbus changed the world, but not all change is worth celebrating. Narrator, if history is a mirror, then Columbus is a crack in the glass, a reminder that greatness and destruction often travel side by side. Thank you for watching. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, like, share, and subscribe, and join us next time as we uncover more stories hidden beneath the surface of history.